Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little essay, A Backward Glace or Traveled Roads, and prefatory letter, a letter to the reader, as he calls it, Leaves of Grass 1889. Now, the assumptions here that you've already been with us throughout the entire reading and study of the deathbed edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist. And that after finishing all of that study, one of the simple questions is, well, what do I do next? And of course, as we said in our conclusion essay lecture, well, you just go back and start all over again. But another answer is to sit down with this really remarkable little, almost 500 paragraph essay. It's not a tremendously long essay, but it's going to take us a few minutes to get through it, and we want to take our time and enjoy it. Here is Whitman in his old age trying to accomplish three things. One, he's going to tell us what he had originally wished he could accomplish in creating and writing over the 30-plus years Leaves of Grass. Two, he's going to be pretty candid and forthright about what he thinks he actually did accomplish. And then finally, three, he's going to tell us a few things about what he wished that he could have accomplished that he probably didn't. One of those is obviously, as we've said several times in our lectures, Leaves of Grass never actually sold to the degree that he had hoped and made him some money, so that for his whole life, he struggled a little bit with not having the amount of emolument that he had wished. Now, our goal here is just simply read and enjoy. We're going to use the Norton's edition so that we can have some notes to help us out. Notice again the date here of May 31st, 1889, Camden, New Jersey, U.S. and America, as hell to say it, which again is wonderful because, as we've said almost 100 times, 92 times in Leaves of Grass, he used this term America. And then he'll begin by saying, today completes my 70 years, and right away our Nortons will tell us on his 70th birthday, aged by illness and infirmity rather than by years, Whitman wrote this very characteristic letter to appear in the 1889 Leaves of Grass, which commemorated his last birthday, as he supposed. We've inserted it here in its original position because it fixes historically the effective date of his determination to recommend that, quote, a backward glance to be included at the end of future editions of Leaves of Grass, and that his final revised text be honored in any future printing. This he did by means of the very specific footnote. Fortunately, he was able to complete another miscellany by my fancy, 1891, and to add his poems as a second annex. Of course, we know this because we just finished with all of those, right, to the final revised Leaves of Grass 1891-92. Truly a deathbed edition, which is reproduced in the present text. It's not completely clear why it's called deathbed edition. There's any number of studies to try and figure that one out. That edition, without this letter, repeated the footnote verbatim, except for the change from 422 pages to 438, and gave it a more prominent position on the verso of the title page, where it also appears in the present edition. Again, today completes my 70 years, rounds and coheres the successive growths and stages of Leaves of Grass. It's actually elegy, as we've seen in a couple of times in the second annex, with the following essay in sort of testament, notice in sort of in parenthetics, my hurried epilogue of intentions bequest, and gives me the crowning content, and then again parenthetics, for these lines are written at the last, the feeling, and definitely perhaps boastfully reiterating, for good or bad, plain or not plain, I have held out and now concluded my utterance entirely its own way. I love how he says it that way, right? We're going to do things on my own terms. The main wonder being, to me, of the foregoing 405 pages entire, amid their many faults and omissions, that after looking over them leisurely and critically as the last week, night and day, they have adhered faithfully to and carried out for nearly 40 years over many gaps, through thick and thin, peace and war, sickness and health, clouds and sunshine, my latent purposes, etc., even as measurably well and far as they do between these covers. Nature evidently achieves specimens only, plants the seeds of suggestions. I love how he uses the word plants in this way, and seeds, of course, we're familiar with. Is not so intolerant of what is called evil, relies on law and character more than special cases or partialities. And in my little scope, I've followed or tried to follow the lesson that, and now Norton's will pause here to tell us that of nature, whose successive growths and stages from the seeds of suggestion often remind Whitman how Leaves of Grass grew from its latent purposes, these reiterations and the laborious revision of the manuscript in successive editions run counter to the theory that Leaves of Grass was originally originally planned as a whole. The present is one of the most concise and clear of Whitman's many pronouncements of this point. And then he says, probably, that is about all. I love that he says probably, and the first word of the actual Backward Glance is the word perhaps. Again, his etymological fallibilism, as we commented in all of our previous lectures. Yes, today finishes my 70th year, and even if but the merest additional preface, and not plain what tie together it was with the following Backward Glance, I suppose I must reel out something to celebrate my old birthday anniversary, and for this special edition of the latest Compliments, Leaves of Grass utterance. And then there's a note that he provides here. As there are now several editions of Leaves of Grass, different texts and dates, I wish to say that I prefer and recommend the present one, complete for future printing if there should be any. A copy and facsimile indeed of the text of these 422 pages, the subsequent interval, which is so important to formed and launched works, books especially, has passed, and waiting till fully after that, I give these concluding words. And then back now to the letter. Printers send word to. There is a blank here, and Norton's will now tell us the old printer and newsman whimsically remembered a constant affection of his trade. A blank here to be written up, and with what it may be part of the jest that he filled the blank with one of his countless letters dealing minutely and cheerfully with his appalling excruciatory and motor infirmaries. Now we'll finish with the letter before we come back to introductions of a Backward Glance from our Nortons. Printers send word to, there's a blank here to be written up, and with what? Probably I may as well transcribe and eke out this note by the following lines of a letter last week to a valued friend who demands to know my current personal condition. Quote, quotation marks. First, asking pardon for long neglect, the perfect physical health, strength, buoyancy, and inward impetus to back them, which were vouchsafed during my whole life, and especially throughout the Succession War period, and he gives the dates of 1860 to 66. Notice he calls it again the Succession War. Everything for Whitman always comes back, as we said in our drum tap study, to the war. Seemed to wane after those years and were closely tracked by a stunning paralytic seizure, and following physical debility and inertia, laggardness, torpor, indifference, perhaps laziness. I love that he admits that, which put me in, low in 1873, 4, and 5, then lifted a little, but have essentially remained ever since. Several spirits or attacks, 5 or 6 of them, one time or another, from 1876 onward, but gradually mainly overcome, till now, 1888 and 9, the worst and most obstinate seizure of all. Upon the whole, however, and even at this, and though old and sick, I keep up, maintain fair spirits, partially read and write, have published last in full and revised editions of my poems and prose, records and results of youth and early and mid-age of absolute strength and health, overseen now during a lingering ill spell, but have had a bad year, this last one, have run a varied gauntlet, chronic constipation, and then vertigo, bladder, and gastric troubles. It's interesting, Whitman's willingness to be honest here. And the aforementioned steady disability and inertia, perhaps, or bequests of the serious paralysis at Washington, D.C., closing the Succession War, as we said, and Whitman himself said it, being a wound dresser led to an early and untimely death for him, and of course the miserable life that he had to live in those last years. That seizure, indeed, the culmination of much that preceded, the real source of all my woes since. During the past year and now, with all these, a body and brain action dulled, while the spirit is perhaps willing and live enough, I get along more contentedly and comfortably than you might suppose. Sit here all day in my big, high, strong, rattan-bottomed chair with great wolfskin spread on the back in cool weather, and you can of course see this in a museum, as writing to you now on a tablet on my lap, maybe my last missive of love, memories, and cheer. And again, I love that he uses the word love. Now, our Nortons will tell us that a Backward Glance over Traveled Roads, notice the alighted word or, appeared with a present title as the introduction to November Boughs of 1888, a prose miscellany preceded by Sands at 70, a cluster of new poems. We've studied them. The November Boughs volume was reissued in London 1889 and inserted in Complete Poems and Prose of 1888 as a supplement without change of pagination. In Leaves of Grass 1889, a limited edition celebrating the poet's 70th birthday, the new poem Sands at 70 appeared as an annex. Also, a Backward Glance was given its final position following the completed poems as a retrospective essay. Preceding a Backward Glance, the poet included an untitled birthday letter to the reader dated May 31st, 1889. course, we just saw it, right? Whitman's footnote to the letter was his first definition of the final text. We've read that as well. Any further printing, if there should be any, should be a copy in facsimile, as he had already told Horace Trebell, leaving the book completely as I left it, quote unquote. This footnote also appears with appropriate page references, as in Lysigrass 1891-92, our master text, on the verso of the present title page. All footnotes by Whitman have been allowed to stand as in the original text, designated by his asterisk, and we'll point them out as we get there. All editions of A Backward Glance from 88 to 1891-92 were printed from the same plates without textual change, except for the correction in Lysigrass 1889 of 2 typographical errors, and we'll have footnotes for those. Pages were not renumbered until the final Lysigrass 1891-92 that we call the deathbed edition. The essay was completed by May of 28, 1888, and set in type 3 days later on the poet's 69th birthday. It resulted from several previous ventures in literary autobiography, the first of which was A Backward Glance on My Own Road, in the Critic of January 5th, 1884. This article on 2 dominant themes foreshadowed the 2 halves of the present essay. The second half of the Critic article was probably derived from the poet's article, How Leaves of Grass Was Made, reported as having appeared in 1885 in the New York Star, but this title is not known until, but this title is now known only by a posthumous article of the same name, allegedly reprinted from the Star as a memorial to Whitman in Frank Leslie's popular monthly of June 1892. Every paragraph of the Leslie text had also appeared before the final draft of the 1888 with minor variants in the poet's article, How I Made a Book, Philadelphia Press, July 11, 1886. Whitman then wrote the first half of his new essay, a revision of the first half of the 1884 Ancestor, and this appeared as My Book and I in Lippincott's Monthly Magazine of January 1887. Every paragraph of A Backward Glance or Traveled Roads appeared in some form in one of the preceding 4 articles, and then a suggestion is made for textual study of these essays. See Whitman's Backward Glance, edited with an introduction by Scully Bradley and John A. Stevenson, and see the edition of the essay in prose 2 as well. A Backward Glance or Traveled Roads, and of course Traveled Roads takes us back to his classic Song of the Open Road, afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road. I love that he begins with the word perhaps. I love that that word so often regularly is used, right? The uncertainty of the epistemological position that we call fallibilism. He's not an absolutist, certainly not. He's not a relativist. He says, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. That's this word perhaps. Perhaps the best of songs heard, or of any and all true love, or life's fairest episodes, or sailor soldiers trying scenes on land or sea, is the resume of them, or any of them, long afterwards, looking at the actualities away back past, with all their practical excitations gone, how the soul loves to float amid such reminiscences, exclamation point. So already you can see, he says, when it's all said and done, one of the really fun things to do is to look back. When you, of course, leave your high school situation, your college situation, in those days that precede graduation, you'll play a very similar kind of game. How much fun is it to look back? And obviously, for those of us that have read every poem of Leaves of Grass, the Deathbed Edition, it's really a lot of fun now to look back, because to have done that project closely will have taken us a few months, obviously, so for some of us several years. And because that's the case, it's fun to look back and say, how has it affected my life? Let's continue. So, here I sit, gossiping in the early candlelight of old age, I and my book, casting backward glances over our traveled road, after completing, as it were, the journey, and of course such a central, such an important motif. A varied jaunt of years with many halts and gaps of intervals, or some lengthened ship voyage wherein more than once the last hour apparently arrived. He thought he was going to die several times. And we seemed certainly going down. He uses the language, of course, of a ship that's going down. Yet reaching port in a sufficient way through all discomfitures at last. Of course, we think about, oh, Captain, my Captain. After completing my poems, I am curious, a favorite word of his, to review them in the light of their own, at the time unconscious and mostly unconscious intentions, with certain unfoldings of the 30 years they seek to embody. These lines, therefore, will probably blend the weft of first purposes and speculation with the warp of that experience afterwards, always bringing strange developments. Of course, he uses the language of Homer with weaving. We think about, of course, Penelope. We think about Helen. We think about Andromache. We think about the weaving motif. We've talked about it at LearnStrong.net when we gave our lectures on Homer. And then notice his use of the word strange, uncertain again. Result of 7 or 8 stages and struggles, and our Nortons here will tell us that Whitman authorized 15 editions or reprints of Leaves of Grass poems. Those representing genuine stages and struggles were 9. 1855, 1856, 1860, 1867, 1871-72, 1876, 1881, 1888 to 1889, and 1891 to 92. The Civil War poems, Drum Taps, 1865, might also be so regarded. So he'll say, a result of 7 or 8 stages and struggles, extending through nearly 30 years, as nigh my 70, I live largely on memory. I look upon Leaves of Grass, now finished to the end of its opportunities and powers, as my definitive carte visite to the coming generations of the new world. And then he'll give a little note here about Champollion. When Champollion on his deathbed handed to the printer the revised proof of his Egyptian grammar, he said gaily, "Be careful of this, it is my carte de visite to posterity." So again, this idea, it's my gift to the world, if you will, okay? Just to return now, he says, if I may assume to say so, that I have not gained the acceptance of my own time, but have fallen back on fond dreams of the future, anticipations, and then in parenthetics with a quotation mark, still lives the song though Ragnar dies, in quote. By the way, your Nortons here will tell us that this is from Alfred the Harper, stanzas 14 and 1.3. A long ballad by John Sterling, King Alfred disguised as a harper, appears at the feast of the Danes who had ravaged the English coast and destroyed Ragnar, the British defender. The harper king boldly praises him in the quoted line, then makes his escape to return victorious in Ragnar's name. John Sterling of 1806 to 1844 was a Scottish-born English poet, publisher, and curate whose life, 1851, was written by Carlyle. Whitman copied the phrase about Ragnar in his notes. So he's drawing, and we're going to hear a lot of this, of his literary antecedents through this. That from a worldly and business point of view, he says, Leaves of Grass has been worse than a failure. So there it is. He knows before he dies it was a complete economic failure. That public criticism on the book, and myself as author of it, yet shows marked anger and contempt more than anything else. I find, by the way, there's now a quotation mark, I find a solid line of enemies to you everywhere, in quote, a letter from W.S.K., Boston, May 28, 1884. This is William Sloane Kennedy, 1850 to 1929, critic and biographer, a late disciple of Whitman, of whom he wrote Reminiscences, 1896, and Concerning Leaves of Grass, the Fight of a Book for the World, 1926. And that's solely, back to Whitman, and that's solely for publishing it. I have been the object of 2 or 3 pretty serious special official buffetings, is all probably no more than I ought to have expected. I had my choice when I commenced. I bid neither for soft eulogies, big money returns, nor the appropriation of existing schools and conventions. In other words, I didn't write Leaves of Grass for any of the normal reasons, he says. As fulfilled, or partially fulfilled, the best comfort of the whole business after a small band of the dearest friends and upholders ever vouchsafed to man or cause, doubtless all the more faithful and uncompromising this little phalanx for being so few, is that unstopped and unwarped by any influence outside the soul within me, I have had my say entirely my own way, and put it unerringly on record, the value, therefore, to be decided by time. So it's going to be interesting. On the one hand, he'll argue, I did everything my own way. On the other hand, he's going to argue, so much of what I've done is borrowed heavily from the great thinkers. We'll get to them in a while. In calculating that decision, William O'Connor and Dr. Burke are far more preliminary than I am. And this is referencing William Douglas O'Connor, who wrote The Good Great Poet of 1866, the earliest vindication of Whitman, and Richard Marcus Burke, who wrote an early biographical study, Walt Whitman, 1883. Both were the poet's devoted friends. Behind all else, now back to Whitman, behind all else that can be said, I consider Leaves of Grass and its theory experimental, as in the deepest sense I consider our American Republic itself to be, with its theory. Now this is again the beginnings, the real heart now, the beginning of the essay, where he's going to make the argument that Leaves of Grass was really nothing more than a great mirror. Isn't this what James Joyce said in his defense of Dubliners, that all he was doing was just holding a mirror up to society? In other words, you want to know about America? Read Leaves of Grass. You want to know about how America was constructed and built and evolved? Read Leaves of Grass and study the evolution of Leaves of Grass. And then in parenthetics he says, I think I have at least enough philosophy not to be too absolutely certain of anything or any results. Again, the fallibilist epistemological position. In the second place, the volume is a sortie, whether to prove, sortie, he uses a military term, whether to prove triumphant and conquer its field of aim and escape and construction, nothing less than 100 years from now can fully answer. His argument is it's going to take our time to decide and define the actual advantages of Leaves of Grass, the value of Leaves of Grass. And this is one of the reasons that we have called it Talks with Walt, and we've engaged in our study to ask, is it still real? I mean, is it worthy of our time and energies to study it? Obviously, I've made the argument, I think it is. He says, I consider the point that I have positively gained a hearing to far more than make up for any and all other lacks and withholdings. Essentially, that was from the first and has remained throughout the main object. Now it seems to be achieved. I am certainly contented to waive any otherwise momentous drawbacks as of little account. Candidly and dispassionately reviewing all my intentions, I feel that they were credible, and I accept the result, whatever it may be. It's his poetic way of saying, I did the best I could. After continued personal ambition and effort, as a young fellow, to enter with the rest into competition for the usual rewards, business, political, literary, etc., to take part in the great melee, both for